The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, one of the biggest crazes of course of the 80s and into the early 90s and a big part of my childhood. And the first video game based on the Turtles was this one, for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. And it's got a lot of polarizing opinions, but the question remains, is TMNT worth playing today? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was originally released in May of 1989 in Japan for the Famicom, and was actually the first piece of TMNT media to actually make it to Japan. It was then released a month later in June for the North American NES. It would later be released in PAL territories and for a number of home computer systems in the future, including Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, Amiga, and of course the infamous DOS version, which is unable to be completed unless you cheat, since one jump is too big in order to actually make it across. In TMNT, you're playing as the Ninja Turtles, Donatello, Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Each Ninja Turtle is armed, of course, with their specialty weapon, and you can switch between the turtles at any time by pausing the game. Your goal is to save April O'Neil originally, as well as making sure that Manhattan itself doesn't get blown up by bombs that have been planted in the Hudson River. Once you're able to accomplish that goal though, the game takes a turn as your master Splinter is kidnapped, and then the second half of the game has you tracking him down and trying to save him from the evil Shredder. Each of the turtles controls the same, whether it be movement speed or platforming ability. However, they do have major differences when it comes to their weapons, giving some of them pluses and minuses to using them. Leonardo is kind of the all-around. Using his katana, he has a decent distance that he's able to hit out in front of him and has good speed to swinging his weapon. Donatello has the longest reach with his weapon and is very useful in certain situations. However, his weapon and throwing it out there is a bit slower than others. Raphael has a very short-ranged weapon, but when he throws out his sai, it spins for a little bit of time, giving it a better opportunity to hit enemies that may be coming near. Michelangelo has also a really short range, but it doesn't stay out very long, so because of this, Michelangelo is considered the weakest as far as the Turtles' weapons are concerned. Along with the main weapons, there are sub-weapons that you're able to gather and find throughout the game. This includes shurikens, a triple-shot shuriken, boomerangs, and of course the kiai, which is basically a scroll that you're able to find, which launches out a big wave-like attack, and if you have these late in the game, you'll be able to bust your way through the Technodrome and even take on Shredder with them. This is the best sub-weapon and honestly the best weapon to have in the game, though they are limited and you're not going to be able to find them until late in the game. The game is broken up into 5 different levels that take place in different locations in New York. You start off at 5th Avenue. There's a handful of buildings and sewers to travel through while you work your way to find April O'Neil, who has been kidnapped by Bebop and Rocksteady. The second level of the game is one that frustrated many gamers over the years, and that is the Hudson River. Here you're traveling to the dam and have to actually eventually jump into the waters of the Hudson River in order to disarm several bombs that have been planted there. You have a very strict time limit in order to disarm all these bombs, and because it's a maze-like area underneath the water, it can sometimes be difficult to locate all of the bombs, though thankfully they're always set in the same locations. There's instant death tentacles that are able to grab you, electric seaweed which will shock you and sometimes is really difficult to swim around, mostly due to the pretty finicky swimming controls. It does feature though one of the best songs in the game by far, but it still doesn't help the fact that this part of the game can be rather painful. After you dry yourself off and head back to your sewer lair, you find out that Splinter has been kidnapped and is off to Wall Street to try to save him. Wall Street itself is a lot of tall buildings with multiple floors to travel up, rooftops that you can actually go across using ropes to guide you, as well as the party van is introduced that you're able to get into and fire missiles at either enemies or breaking down barriers. You have a limited amount of missiles and you have to go inside the buildings in order to find them. Unfortunately though, if you end up gaming over and continuing from this stage, you lose the missiles and the ropes that you ended up gathering, making it a pain having to retraverse building after building to get more rope and to get more missiles. The fourth level doesn't get any easier from the navigation standpoint. Here you travel the JFK airport. You have planes flying overhead trying to drop missiles onto the turtles, and lots of underground areas for you to travel through. They're all numbered, so you can kind of get an idea of how you're progressing, with your goal being to go to the highest number possible, eventually facing off with the boss at the end and heading to the 5th level. The game was already difficult, but once you make it to the 5th level, the difficulty ramps up a few notches. Here you're at Shredder's base, which is located in the Bronx. Here you have to go through a series of underground areas that potentially could have the location of the Technodrome. Unfortunately, though, it's random every time you play, so you may go through one time and find the Technodrome right away, or you may have to travel to several of the locations in order to eventually locate it. Every time you travel through these underground areas, though, they are filled to the brim with some of the toughest enemies in the game, making it very easy in order to lose all your health. In fact, usually when I'm playing through the game, if I don't find the Technodrome right away, I just reset and start the game over from the beginning, so I have a much better chance of keeping my turtles alive. Once you do find the Technodrome and even battle it, you go inside of it for a big labyrinth maze that you have to travel through in order to eventually make it the Shredder. The final level of the game doesn't feature a world top-down perspective map like the other previous levels did. It's just a straightforward march through very tough enemies and traps until eventually making it the Shredder. TMNT is by no means an easy game, but I don't necessarily think it's one of the hardest that the NES has to offer. The combat is a bit clunky, especially if you're using some of the turtles with the not-so-great weaponry. The enemies are the big part of this, though, because they spawn kind of randomly and can respawn over and over again. The game uses kind of a random number generator every time you go through areas or backtrack through areas, causing potentially more enemies to spawn and even changing some of the enemies that you're currently fighting. This game is infamous for going into an area and having a certain set of enemies, exiting, coming back, and it's a different set of enemies that you have to battle. Sometimes it ends up working in your favor, and other times it just becomes annoying that you have to keep going through so many enemies to traverse some of the areas. It also features some difficult platforming, such as the gap that you're able to walk over, of course, but also the really difficult sewer jump that you have to make in the 3rd level, and if you miss it, you fall into the sewer water, go outside the building, and have to travel through it again just for another attempt. Combine that with maze-like elements that some of the buildings and areas you have to explore are, with some paths that just lead to dead ends, or worse, sometimes they'll lead to a health item, which could be useful, but by the time you gather the pizza and try to get back out of the area, you've lost all the health, if not more, that it took to actually get to that health replenishment. The game also has a lack of recognizable TMNT villains for you to battle. Outside of Foot Clan soldiers and the bosses, most of the other enemies are just kind of randomly put together. The game was released during the 3rd season of the cartoon, so there wasn't as many villains thrown into the mix during the days of the cartoon and the action figures, but still would have been nice to see a few more. Though thankfully we got Bebop and Rocksteady, though it's kind of just an okay fight. You did have the giant Mauser at the end of level 4, and then the battle against Mecha Turtle, not to be confused with Metalhead, who would be introduced later on, or the other turtle that was eventually introduced as well in Slash. One of the most standout things for me, though, with TMNT was the soundtrack, composed by Jun Funahashi, who would only go on to work on a few other games as far as sound and music was concerned, including Adventures of Bayou Billy, another one of my absolute favorites, and then a hidden gem for the Nintendo DS he helped with the sound design called Lost in Blue. I highly recommend checking that one out if you never have. One of the first things that many kids noticed when they got the game was the cover art, featuring the 4 turtles, though, with all red bandanas. This is something that they did have in the comic, but of course we were much more familiar with their different colored bandanas that were in the cartoon and the action figures, and since we really weren't as familiar with the comics, this just ended up seeming odd at the time. The cover art, though, is actually based off of an issue, the 2nd reprint of TMNT issue 4 from Mirage Comics, and was also used as some of the arcade flyer art for the TMNT beat-em-up that came out a year after this title. Due to, I'm sure, a lot of the popularity of the Turtles themselves, TMNT would go on to sell over 4 million copies, making it one of the top-selling third-party titles the NES ever had. It may be one of those games that isn't as fondly remembered as some of the NES classics, but being the first Turtles game, I loved it. It was one of those ones I really wanted to get my hands on and have a lot of fond memories. It definitely filled the void until the superior arcade TMNT game came to the NES, and then years later with Turtles in Time, easily one of the best beat-em-ups of all time. Though, is this game worth checking out today? If you're a TMNT fan, it's well worth giving a look to, though it can be difficult to get a hold of it outside, of course, of emulators and ROMs. Thankfully, the game is still relatively cheap on the scope of NES titles, and did see a release on the Wii Virtual Console, though due to licensing it was removed, which is something that's been an issue with a lot of the Turtles games. We would see re-releases of the arcade game and the not-so-fantastic remake of Turtles in Time, but due to licensing issues, these games are no longer available on PS3 and Xbox 360 either. But if you are able to track down a copy of it, I do recommend giving it a look. You may find an action game that has flaws, but can still be enjoyed. Anyway guys, though, that's going to wrap up this review. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.